All right. So kind of get some housekeeping stuff out of the way. And then we'll jump into material here today. So a couple things maybe I wasn't as clear on, or maybe just people weren't listening. You never know. In the slides, I didn't make the point. We weren't starting with module readings. I said I'll give you module readings starting with module 2 through 13. So that module 1 reading, I think I even made the point, it was worth 0 points. So it's just set for review. So the questions that are embedded in that first module, you can't access or respond to, right? They're kind of giving you an idea of what the questions will look like. We're not going to be using those module readings for points until after class today. You'll see the very first module reading pop up, which is module reading for module 2, okay? So you can't currently see it. It's going to pop up there after class today, okay? So module 2 is the first one that you actually have to respond to, answer those questions for points. It's not just going to be set for review. So I got questions about module 1, answering the questions. You didn't have to, right? And we're not starting with the module readings until module 2. I just put that up there so you would have access to chapter 1 or module 1 of the book as we're covering it today, okay? Any questions on that? Also, after class, I talked with the rep. The paywall should have been taken down Tuesday afternoon, so you shouldn't have any issues with that anymore. If you already paid for it, it shouldn't prompt you, for an additional payment anymore. So that should be resolved. Another thing I wanted to mention if you're registering for Packback, I updated the slides, and the PowerPoint and the syllabus are both updated on Canvas. So if you downloaded them, those don't change, obviously, but the files that are on Canvas, if you re-access them, re-download them, or preview them, I updated them slightly. So one of the things that I changed, let's see if we can find it here. If you're having issues registering for Packback, simply using the link on Canvas, and I'll talk about this more next week when we actually have a Packback assignment. You can go directly to the website, but you'll need a community lookup key. So I put the community lookup key here in the slides on the Packback registration slide. So if you're having issues getting registered for that, simply going through that Packback link on the left side of Canvas, try doing it this way, okay? The only other thing, someone asked me after class, this is why asking questions is always good. I was looking at the 2024 schedule, if I'm being completely honest, when looking at the final exam for this class. So the time was not correct that I told you on Tuesday. It still is Monday, May 5th, a finals week. But instead of from 8 to 10, it's going to be from 5:20 to 7:20 p.m. I think that's probably a little bit more desirable for most of you, right? So there might be this first week, we have a quiz, right? That'll pop up after class. There might be a question about when the final exam is. I want to be clear, and it's updated on everything that's on Canvas. It's May 5th from 5:20 to 7:20, okay? So 2 things that you should have done before we meet in class next Tuesday: this first week's module quiz and the first module reading, which is module 2. Remember, module readings are always going to be like 1 week in advance of when we actually cover the material to try to prime your brain for it. When are those due? Not Tuesday. When are they due? The end of the day on Monday, right? So those quizzes are due at the end of the day on Monday. Module readings are due at the end of the day. In fact, they're a little bit different. Module readings are due when? I said there's a sync issue, so let's make them due at 11:50, right? We're just making sure you're getting done a little bit before the end of the day there, okay? So those are your 2 assignments you have to have done by the end of the day Monday, essentially. Also, if you would please fill out that collaborative learning poll. If you don't, I just will use your preference as whatever I decide it is. But if you fill it out by Sunday, I will use those preferences to kind of try to divide you up into these different CL day and time locations. Once again, you can attend whichever one works for you. Week to week, you can change. It's just a way for me to kind of have it guaranteed that there's a slot open for you. Also, I've got the locations corrected, or it makes more sense. So Thursdays will all be in Hodge Hall, and then Sundays will all be in Ballantine, right? So make that a little bit easier, okay? Other than that, any questions for me before we jump into material here today? Yeah. One tonight, what? Yeah. So the CL sessions don't start until next week, right? So I think if you go in the syllabus, wherever they're referenced, or actually here. I went too fast. Oh, there we go. Right, they don't start until next week, the 23rd and the 26th. Yep. Okay. Any other questions for me before we get started here? Okay. All right. Oh, so we will start out actually covering module material. So economics at its core, we're giving like a textbook definition or my kind of, I'll probably cater it a little bit. It's really how are we using scarce resources, right, to make optimal decisions? Or how are we taking scarce or limited resources and making decisions that have the best or most efficient impact on society? Or sometimes we look at the individual level, right? So how, a lot of the times we think about this scarce resource in terms of us, like individually. So why don't you go out and buy like your ideal car? And my wife loves the Cybertrucks, right? I don't really get it, but she thinks they're cool. Why don't we go out and buy a Cybertruck? I don't have enough money, right? So there's limited resources. I have limited resources of money, and I have to allocate that resource towards different things: cars, house, right, electric, food, right? So, excuse me. So you can't just go out and do whatever brings us the most happiness, right? Or whatever we would value the most. Because anytime I spend money on something, I'm not spending on something else, right? We've got trade-offs. Okay. So it doesn't just have to be time. Scratch that. It doesn't just have to be money. It can also be time, right? If I'm thinking about another real scarce resource that a lot of you have, a lot of you probably don't have, the income isn't as widely distributed. It's, most college students tend to be on the lower end of the income distribution, but you all have a very scarce resource, which is time, that you have to decide how you allocate it towards school, maybe a part-time job, hanging out with friends, right? So it's not just money that we're thinking about. It's any scarce resource that we think about. How do we optimally allocate it to different activities, right? I just think money is probably the one that most of us default to and the easiest to think about. We're going to think about from a company standpoint. I've got a bunch of different workers. How do I assign them to different projects, right? I can only, they've only got so many hours they can work a week. How do I assign them the most efficiently for my company? Okay. So that's like at our core, that's the economic problem. Okay. We'll then make this distinction between macroeconomics, right? Which are things like inflation, money supply, interest rates. We won't really dive into macro issues. Actually, module 2 is probably kind of a macroeconomic model. But really, that's going to be saved for B252. That's going to be like the second, I guess, this class. You dive more into the macroeconomic issues. We're really going to focus on micro. So macro means big, right? The study of the economy as a whole, right? So this would be like comparing and contrasting capitalism to communism, things like that. Micro, we're looking at individual decision-making. We're looking at specific markets. We're looking at things on a smaller level. Okay? So microeconomics, not only can we look at firms, but individual decision-making, maybe choices of the government. We won't probably do a lot of this. We kind of stick to individual and firm choices, but you can also get very specific into like what field you're trying to analyze the choices of. So macroeconomics is like the economy as a whole. Microeconomics, you can focus on sectors like the health sector, just on public policy or government. You could look at, a field I've done a little bit of research in. I look like sports economics. You can look at sports markets specifically. So you're looking at things at like a smaller level than the entire economy. Okay. It shouldn't be too bad. All right, micro versus macro. Micro, small, right? Macro, big. Okay. We're also in all the models that we're going to be talking about this semester, and kind of an underlying assumption that we have is that individuals or firms or countries or government are all acting out of self-interest, and they're all making rational decisions. So what that means, right, is if I'm making decisions that are rational, I'm making a decision that makes me the best off that I can be. I'm not choosing to do something that makes me worse off. That's being rational. Self-interest means what am I trying to maximize? I'm trying to maximize my own happiness. Okay. Now that can be, right, more money, right? That can be, you know, a lot of times we think about firms, they're trying to maximize profits. Individuals are trying to maximize wealth. But that's not always the case, right? Why might I want to work? I don't know, actually, why did I want to go stay in academia and work as a professor instead of go work for, you know, a Fortune 500 company, I don't know, in the finance sector or something like that. Well, they work like dogs, right? They don't have summers off, right? It's a lot more cutthroat. There's things other than money that are attractive to me about being a professor as opposed to working in kind of the corporate world, right? Now, for some people, it might be the exact reverse, right? They really like that, right? But it's not just money, right? We're thinking about what brings individuals the most happiness. Money is part of that equation, but there's other things as well. So we say people are making self-interested, rational choices if they're making decisions that maximize their own happiness. Okay. Right. So why might not this be good for society? If we don't think about this, if we think about this like an individual level, what might we choose to do? So if I'm driving down the road, and I don't know, I'm eating a granola bar or something, I don't like to keep my car like a trash can. So what might, I would never do this, but what might I do? Roll my window down and toss it out, right? That might be my self-interested, rational decision. I don't care. Doesn't, you know, it's not a cost to me, the fact that it's out there in the environment. Well, if everybody makes that decision, what do we end up with? We're living in a landfill, right? So sometimes these self-interested, rational decisions aren't what's best for the society as a whole, right? So if you look at micro decision making, sometimes it doesn't lead to the optimal decision at the macro level. So once again, this class, we're really going to focus on that micro level decision making, individuals and firms. We'll also talk a little bit about how that might result in a net negative outcome for society or for the entire kind of market. Any questions on that one? I don't realize this was in the way here. So any questions on that before we keep moving here? Shouldn't be too bad. Just kind of setting us up here to talk about some things more in depth. So the concept that we'll spend a lot of time today, a lot of today's time on, is opportunity costs. Okay. So the textbook kind of definition of opportunity cost, it's the value of whatever you're giving up or whatever you're foregoing by choosing to do something else. Okay. So this, once again, this can be money, this can be time, right? You know, I think about some different things like, let's say if I'm going out to eat for lunch, right? If I go get lunch at Chipotle, what was my opportunity cost? Well, I didn't go somewhere else. I didn't go to Chick-fil-A or whatever other restaurant you're thinking of, right? You're always giving something up, right? And the opportunity cost is going to be the value of what you're not doing. Okay? So for instance, if I'm working an hourly job, hourly wage job, and I call off work an hour early, so I can, I don't know, go drive to Indianapolis to do something that I want to do. What's my opportunity cost of going to Indianapolis? What could I have done with that hour? That hour. Whatever my hourly wage rate was, right? So anytime you choose to do something, I choose to drive to Indianapolis to do something, that hour I give up, my opportunity cost is what could I have done with that hour? I could have worked and made, you know, $15 an hour or whatever it is. Okay. So anytime we choose to do something, there's always an opportunity cost associated with it. Okay? So another one we can think about, not just money, but like time, right? I'm sitting there wasting time on TikTok, right? Instead of paying attention to what Professor Landis is saying, right? What was my opportunity cost of TikTok usage? Well, maybe it cost me in terms of my grade, right? Right. So there's always going to be an opportunity cost to doing something. We often will try to put dollar amounts to it, but sometimes it's more of like a how much what the actual value is. Like I said, in my example, you think about it in terms of the cost was in terms of your grade. See a hand back there? Yeah. So that would be incorporated, and we'll have an example here in a second, into like our total cost. right? Because choosing to go to Indianapolis, what are you giving up? You're not giving up using the gas, right? That was part of like what we'll end up, we don't go into it in this chapter, but explicit versus implicit costs. That was like a cost associated with you had to pay that to go there, right? So for example, maybe, oh, let me think of one. So let's say I'm like an auditorium and I want to have like some comedian come in, right? So let's say it's a really popular comedian. I don't know who it would be. Who's actually coming to Indianapolis? I think Shane Gillis is coming to Indianapolis here, not sometime this semester. So let's say I bring him in and he can bring in $200,000 of revenue, right? Well, instead I look at some like smaller musical artists and I think I could bring them in, and I had to pay, you know, maybe it's not that he just brings in $200,000. That was like my net benefit, right? After I paid him and the amount of money, ticket sales, I made $200,000. Well, if I choose instead to have like a small band come in and maybe I pay them $20,000 to play there, would I make $100,000 off that band? Well, $20,000 when I had to pay the band, that's like part of my cost to having them play. But choosing to have that band come play, what was my opportunity cost? I didn't make the $200,000 I could have made if instead I had that comedian. So a little bit different, right? It's still a cost, but it's not an opportunity cost. Opportunity cost is going to be something that you have to give up not doing. The value of giving up something in order to do what you're choosing to do. Does that help? Okay. Do I have any other examples here? So we kind of already talked through this. Calling off work, I already chose, went through this example. So no such thing as a free lunch, right? This is kind of the age-old adage in economics, right? Even when something's free, there's still going to be some cost to it because there's always an opportunity cost. If you choose to do something, you use your time or you use a scarce resource of your income, you're always not doing something else. So for instance, if someone's like, yeah, like I've got 2 free tickets to, the IU basketball game for the next upcoming game, it's completely free to you. The price is 0. Well, it's not, right? Because if I go, what am I doing? I'm using some of my time. What could I have done with that time? Well, I could have maybe worked. I could have studied for an upcoming test. I could have hung out with friends, which I might value at a certain degree. So I'm always giving up something. So there's always going to be some cost, some opportunity cost to doing anything. Okay. Like the only way that wouldn't be is like if you somehow like don't exist if you don't do that. It doesn't wouldn't make any sense, right? So there's always an opportunity cost to anything that you do. Okay. I was thinking about this the other day to make like somewhat of a relevant example. I saw we could Google it. I saw like maybe it wasn't 40 million, maybe it was something like, I thought it was like $40 million or something crazy they had cut from the LA Fire Department. So I'm sure when they made that decision, they were like, we're allocating our scarce resource, we're putting it towards other things, right, in the community that we think are good. But what was the opportunity cost of taking that 40 million and spending it on? God only knows what the government spent it on, right? Well, the huge opportunity cost there of not being able to deal with a fire that happened, right? Billions of dollars ended up being their opportunity cost. They are diverting those resources somewhere else. So there's always going to be some opportunity costs. If we choose to do something, it's what the value of what we're giving up. Okay. So to kind of give a little toy example, to start to think about opportunity costs, and then we'll transition to another type of cost. Let's think about like rental decisions. So I think if you are thinking about getting an apartment for next year, you've already missed the boat, at least how I remember college rental markets working. You've got to be like at least a year almost in advance. But let's say there's still things available, right? So you're thinking about 3 apartments and here's the monthly rental rate. So just to make some easy numbers. Right? So if I'm just thinking, I'm looking at this, let's say everything's the exact same about these apartments, same layout. They both, have the same amenities. Everything's exactly built in the same year. Which of these apartments would you choose? The cheapest one, right? Now, what's probably a main attribute about these apartments, even if they were otherwise identical, look the exact same, built the same year, what's something that matters a lot to you as a college student? How close they are to campus, right? You know, some of these apartment complexes that are a lot further from campus, they can't command as high of a rental rate as ones that are really close, right? In fact, even if like the things that are close are like dilapidated and don't look quite as nice, right? When I was in college, I lived in this place that was like a couple blocks when I was a grad student, a couple blocks from the only building I really had to be at in grad school. And it was a studio apartment, and honestly probably could have been condemned, right? But I still paid a decent amount of money for it because I wanted to be right there, right? So what if we have different distances, right? So here I kind of said, okay, look, A is 5 minutes from campus. Let's say, what's the monthly time it would take me if I lived at these apartments over the course of the month? I might have to use 12 hours commuting to and from apartment A to where I want to go. Apartment B is a little bit further out. Apartment C is even further. So here's kind of like my time cost. Right? Well, if I choose one of these apartments, the cost is not just the rental rate. It's going to be however much I value the time that I'm giving up. So what might be an easy way, if I was trying to put a value to this time, if I'm working a job, what would be an easy way to put a value to that time? How much I could have been making if I was working. That's not perfect, right? You can actually, like, in practice, you can ask people how much they value their time. They can, self-report, and we can put a value that way. But the easiest way to think about it, I think, starting out is, let's just say I could make $10 an hour at my part-time job, and I would have 12 more hours a month to be able to devote to working, making $10 an hour. How would I find the total cost, or sorry, how would I find the opportunity cost of living in apartment A then? Well, if it's going to take me 12 hours, each hour is valued at $10, the total opportunity cost of living in apartment A would be I'm giving up $120, right? Just 10 times those 12 hours. I can do the same thing for apartment B. If I chose to live in apartment B, what's the opportunity cost? What am I giving up? Not working now, not 12 hours, but not working 24 hours. And the opportunity cost if I choose apartment C, what am I not doing? Giving up 36 hours. So the opportunity cost of living in each one of these locations is going to vary. Okay. So everybody with me on that? Any questions on that before we kind of complicate it a little bit? Okay. So notice apartments further from campus are going to incur larger opportunity costs, right? You're going to have to give up more of your time. Okay. So if I then think about what are my total costs, that would be the rental rate as well as, so it's kind of like your idea of like going to Indianapolis. My total cost would be the price of gas plus the amount of money I'm giving up not working. So here my total cost is the rental rate plus the value of the time that I'm giving up by living in that location. And then I kind of did this monthly. Okay. Okay. Any questions on those total costs? So if I'm now making the decision about which apartment to live at, and for this case, we just care about the value, right? Money. Which apartment should I now choose? Right? What's the lowest total cost? B, right? So when we factor in opportunity cost, this is like a dumb, easy toy example, but it shows that like if we didn't factor in opportunity cost, we said we should have been choosing apartment C. But if you actually factor in the opportunity cost, the optimal self-interested rational decision should have been that you chose apartment B. Right? Now, what if you value your time even more? So let's say instead of $10 an hour, I could be making 20. Well, what apartment is going to start to become a lot more attractive? My time is valued higher. Am I going to want to give up more or less of that time? Less. So what apartment is more attractive? The one that's close, right? The one where I have to give up less time. In fact, we could work through the math, right? Calculate our new opportunity cost, where every hour is worth $20. Now, that would, our time was valued a little bit higher. Now, maybe the optimal decision would be to choose apartment A. Okay. I'll give another example that kind of connects this idea of opportunity cost. So valuing your time more means you would want to be more likely to choose the apartment where you're not giving up as much of your time. So if you think about people whose time is valued a lot, who would you think about? Name, type of person. I don't know, Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg. Their time is insane. I mean, tens of hundreds of thousands. I mean, you calculate it out. It's ridiculous, right? So their time is insanely valuable. They're not choosing apartments, that are close to their work, but what are they doing that we wouldn't, anyone in this room, I would assume typically is not going to do? Their time is so valuable that they choose to buy. What do all of these major CEOs usually have? Private jets. Why? Because they don't want to waste time with commercial air flight, right? They don't, their time is so valuable, it actually is a self-interested, rational decision for them to buy their own private jet. I think I heard Mark Cuban, once talking about, it's like, it seems like it's this extravagant, thing that these major CEOs are doing. It's not, it's a business decision. Your time is so valuable, right, that it actually makes sense to pay this additional amount for a private jet, because your time, you're giving up so much if you waste your time kind of relying on commercial airlines. So I try to think of these examples and that we can kind of see play out in the real world. And that would be one of them that kind of connects with this idea of valuing your time a little bit more. Okay. Any questions on that? Good with that? All right. Okay. So, a little bit different, and this isn't like a perfect example of it. I'll think about phrasing this in a slightly different way in a second, but using this same idea of apartments, let's go back to those old total costs where we had our time valued at $10. So what would the marginal cost be of moving apartments? So let's assume now that I currently was in that apartment A, the first apartment. I was paying $1,000 a month in rent. My opportunity costs or commuting costs was $120 every month. My total cost being $1,120. If I instead choose to move to this second apartment, what would my marginal cost be? So this word of marginal, we're going to use it a lot throughout the semester. Another way of thinking about it is the additional or the change in. So the marginal cost is the additional cost or the change in the cost from choosing to do that thing. So moving from my current apartment to apartment 2, what is the change in my cost there? So what would my marginal cost be if I moved from my current apartment to this second one? The total cost changes by $120. What if I choose to move to this third apartment? My marginal cost or the change in my total cost would be $240, right? So this word of marginal, it's just the change in. Right? So you got marginal costs or the change in costs from making a certain decision. Okay. So we can think about what's the marginal cost of studying for an additional hour? Okay. Well, this kind of starts to highlight something that I'll focus a little bit more on here in a second. But if I'm choosing to study, what hours in your week do you probably choose to kind of allocate towards studying first? The hours in which you have nothing else really going on, or essentially you're going to start giving up hours that you don't value as much, right? For me, when I was in college, I always tried to get homework or study and do things when I had time blocks in between classes where I really couldn't do anything, because by the time I walked somewhere and walked back, so that was a very low value hour to me. So I was willing to give it up to study during that time block. What if I want to continue to study more and more? What do I have to start doing? Well, there's only so many of those time blocks in my week. Eventually, I start to have giving up hours at the end of the day when I would be, at the rec center playing basketball or doing other things. I have to start to give up more and more valuable hours. So what's happening to my opportunity cost as I choose to study more and more? If I'm giving up more and more valuable hours, what's increasing? So if I'm giving up something that is my opportunity costs, well, our opportunity costs get built into our total costs. So if our opportunity costs are increasing, what's happening to our marginal costs as well? They're increasing. right? So as we choose to do more of something, typically we have to start giving up more and more valuable hours. Or if you think about like a company, I start to have to give up more and more valuable workers to devote to certain tasks. I have to give up more and more valuable dollars, start to pull money away from other areas that were more and more important, right? Like if I'm LA, I'm probably starting to pull away like, I don't know, money away from like the arts and humanities of the city and start putting, well, that's the low value. Maybe I have to start pulling things away from some of the other infrastructure, right? Bridges, things like that, because I really need to focus on this new problem that we have, which is having enough resources to deal with kind of these fires. So we're thinking about typically marginal costs are increasing. Okay. Now we will have some examples, and I bring this up because we'll have some simplifying assumptions for certain models throughout the semester where we don't have increasing marginal costs. So it's probably safe to assume that in any example we're talking about marginal costs are increasing. I will have some where you were told marginal costs are not increasing, but they're instead something else. So let's think about I'm driving somewhere. For every additional mile I drive, right? If I don't, let's say I don't think about the time, like I live, I always hesitate to say even where. I live somewhere up towards Ellettsville, right? A little bit further out of Bloomington, something like a 15-minute commute every day. My time is always the same to commute. But what is going to change my marginal cost of getting to and from campus every day? I drive by a bunch of them on the way here. What's constantly changing? Gas prices, right? So what's the marginal cost of driving each additional mile in my car? Gas price, right? Now on the same day, every mile I drive, what's the cost of every additional mile? Well, take, whatever the gallon of gas is divided by like miles per gallon. I can figure out it's constant though, right? So we have these kind of weird examples sometimes where we'll end up having these constant marginal costs. Now I'll have an example here in a second where I use it as like a simplifying assumption. So we got to walk before we can run. Sometimes I'll start out showing you what it looks like with a constant marginal cost, and then more of like what we expect in the real world, that we have like these increasing opportunity costs that are built in. But I wanted to use that example to think about it's not only opportunity costs that change our marginal cost. Sometimes it's costs like gas prices, right? Or wage rate I have to pay my workers if I'm a firm, things like that. Okay. So, well, yeah. What do I have here? We'll walk through this and then I've got some dot cam work that we'll do. So we already had talked about we just talked about marginal cost. So what would the marginal benefit be? Marginal cost was the change in my cost or the additional cost. Marginal benefit is the change in my benefit or the additional benefits from choosing to do something. Okay. So the additional benefit associated with making a choice, whether that's buying something, producing something if I'm a firm, etc. Okay. So what would the marginal benefits be of accepting a job? From the individual standpoint, it's probably an easy one to think about. Usually when I think about additional benefits, when it comes to like taking a job offer or working, what would my marginal benefit be for accepting a job offer? What's the additional benefit to me if I take that job offer? My salary, right? Or the way my income I can make by working there throughout the next year. Or an hourly wage rate job. What would be the marginal benefit of each additional hour that I work? Making $15 an hour, the additional benefit would be $15. Now, that might not be everything, right? If I accept the job offer, it may not just be the additional salary that I'm making. What else might be a benefit? Status, right? Sometimes I have thoughts and I have to be careful. So there's some professions that I think get a lot of joy out of the status they have in society, and like to act like, I don't know, the world would. So I can say this because my wife's a principal. Some teachers act like they're doing God's work day in and day out, and that they are the backbone. And by all means, we need them, and they're great. But right, they sometimes hold a level of status right? And that brings them a certain amount of joy that they can say that they're in this role, right? I think, not to pick on specific, but nurses, I think, sometimes have that air about them as well, right? That there's some value, there's some benefit it brings them to being able to say they work this job, right? So status is a good one. What's something else, right? What's another benefit? Insurance, right? It could be other monetary packages that exist in the job. Maybe I really value my time, right? Part of the additional benefit is how many hours will I get back from working this job, right? I think this is a bad thing about teaching back-to-back sections. I probably already said this, right? Like, I love having my summers off. That time to me is very valuable, right? And so, well, I still teach in the summer usually, but having parts of the summer off, I find very valuable, right? And so that's a benefit. So it's not always money, right? It's not always, it's just sometimes these other things as well, right? Now let's think about this from a firm standpoint. What's the additional benefit if I sell another gallon of gas? What's the benefit to me as a firm? So we'll be careful, and we haven't talked about it yet. We can think about it as profit, but really the additional benefit, profit's taking into consideration how much money I receive, but also how much money I spend, right? So truly the marginal benefit of selling something is simply the price you're selling it for, right? Or the revenue that you're generating, okay? So we can think about this from the individual standpoint, from the firm standpoint. We have these marginal benefits, right? These additional benefits from doing something. I kind of already jumped the gun on this one. Another one, just because we have the apartment example, that's kind of interesting. I know they've done some studies, natural experiment studies on it. Let's say I had an apartment. Let's say I really wanted to know what's the value of a better view, right? If I'm a real estate agent, how much more could I sell this house for because it has a great view? Well, one way we can see how much money people are willing to pay for a better view. Let's say I had an apartment complex, and it's like a square, right? There's a lot of them around here, just square. One side faces where the sun comes up, right? The sunrise. The other side faces another building, right? Well, what can I do? It's the exact same layout on the exact same floor in that apartment. I can actually look at how much more am I able to charge people on this side of the building versus the other. That tells me the additional benefit of the view, right? The marginal benefit, how much more people are willing to pay for that view. Another way of thinking about this is you can do a same thing, like a similar thing with an apartment complex, and look at apartments on the outside of the building versus the ones on the inside. So one's without a window or one's with. And you can actually determine how much more are people willing to pay for the exact same apartment. There we've kept the location the same, it's the same layout. It's just one of them has windows, the other doesn't. Right? So we think about marginal benefits from a lot of different things. And then we'll run into my next example, which is always a fun one, which is me drinking, right? So let's think about someone consuming something. So I'm going to call this Q, which is quantity, right? So this could be the number of hours you devote to something, the quantity of hours. This could be the number, in my example, of beers that you consume, right? We're just going to think about Q here as representing the quantity of something. So as I buy more of something, generally what's going to happen to my marginal benefit? We can kind of think about this, right? And I'll connect this to marginal costs and things like that. So I always use this example because it's, I don't know, makes sense to me. If you haven't had a home or I guess your parents didn't make you do chores, maybe it won't connect to you as much. But if I'm mowing the lawn in the summer on a 90+ degree humidity day, when I get done mowing the lawn, I mean, the thing that sounds the best to me is going to my garage fridge and getting an ice cold beer, right? I would pay a lot of money for that. If I didn't have one, I'd pay my neighbor a lot to have one of theirs, right? So I might value that first beer, right? Quenching my thirst, just relaxing after this strenuous activity of taking care of the yard on a hot day. I might value it. It might bring me a high additional benefit, right? It's not money. So this is one where we're not talking about benefits in terms of money. This is just how much happiness it brings me. Now, how do we equate happiness to numerical values? we'll hold off on that. It's a little bit more, a subsequent module. For now, just think about if I could put like a dollar amount to how much happiness it brings me. It brings me like a value of $20. I would pay $20 to consume or have that first beer. Right? Now, after I have the first one, I'm still hot. I drank it pretty fast, right? It's Saturday afternoon, right? I still want to kind of relax after this activity. I still value having another one pretty hot, right? And then we can kind of continue maybe the third one. It's not as valuable to me. The fourth one starts to get pretty low. Now, eventually I get to a point, if I have the fifth beer, right? So I'm just kind of plotting these points. If I get to the fifth beer, now my wife's yelling at me because I'm half lit on a Saturday afternoon, right? So maybe the marginal benefit becomes negative, right? But for these first four, I've got some positive marginal benefit. What's happening to my marginal benefit here? As I consume more of something, generally the marginal benefit is decreasing, right? You can kind of think about this, the most extreme example I always like to use. It's hard to put a dollar on it, but what's the marginal benefit to going from having 0 to 1 car? Huge, right? Unless you're in a town where you can walk it. I guess in Bloomington it doesn't make as much sense. I grew up like in a town of like I think we had like just over 1,000 people, and you couldn't get anywhere unless you had a car. There was nothing in town. Literally, I mean, not even a grocery store, right? So it's like if you don't have a car, your life sucks. The value of having that first car, insanely high marginal benefit. What's the marginal benefit of having a second car? Well, if I'm just one person, can't even use both the cars at the same. Maybe it's a cool car I drive in the summer, like a Jeep, I can take the top off, but like it's not near as valuable as having that first car was, right? So that's a really extreme example where the marginal benefit like starts really high and decreases dramatically, right? A lot of times you can think about when you're buying something, right? What do you go out and buy? You buy the first pair of shoes that you like the most, right? They bring you, you're going to wear them the most. They're going to bring you the highest marginal benefit. Then if you have additional resources, you start to buy like what you value the next most and the next and the next, right? So as we do more of something, as we buy more of something, what's happening to the marginal benefit? Generally, it's declining, okay? So I think I've got here, we'll use red. So this is my marginal benefit. I've just kind of put it in terms of a graph, right? So let's say I don't have any beer left. I get done mowing the lawn and I go over to my neighbor and I'm like, man, I really could use an ice cold beer. And like, you can have some of mine. They're not free. I don't really like you that much. I'm going to charge you $4 a beer, right? So what is that price essentially to me? It's not my marginal benefit. If I'm choosing to buy an additional beer here, the price would be my marginal cost, right? So the additional benefit I get is like the positive aspect to me from consuming this. The additional amount of money I have to spend, that's the marginal cost. So here is a simplified example where what's the marginal cost of every single beer? In this example, it's constant, right? Now, theoretically, if we wanted to get real serious, every dollar I spend, I'm not spending on other things. So technically my opportunity costs are a little bit higher. So in practice, we never probably truly have a perfectly constant marginal cost. It's probably like the very least slightly upward sloping. But for the models, sometimes that we'll look at, especially initially, we got to walk before we can run. We'll start out with a very easy constant marginal cost. And I'll go through one in a second where it's not, where it's more realistic, where we have these, what do we say? Marginal costs are typically decreasing, right? Marginal costs are typically increasing, right? Our marginal benefits were the ones that are decreasing. So if I'm thinking about making optimal decisions here, we generally say that as long as the marginal benefit of doing something, buying something, putting another hour towards that activity, to allocating my worker to that task, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, we should choose to do it, right? Because it brings me $20 of happiness and it only costs me $4 to buy, it's like my net benefit there would be what? $16, right? I'm net positive, right? I'm net better off. So we would choose to buy as long as that marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost. And in fact, well, I'll do it this way. So we're thinking about net benefits here. So net benefits. We're going to choose to do something as long as the net benefit is positive. What that's really saying is if I just rearrange this equation a little bit, so if I subtract marginal cost from both sides, my net benefit really is simply that difference between marginal benefits and marginal costs. So I'm just doing a little bit of algebra here. Oh yeah, the reason why I choose to do something as long as the marginal benefit is above the marginal cost is because that reflects that there were positive net benefits. What's the net benefit? It's just the difference between the additional benefits and the additional costs. So if the additional benefits minus the additional costs are greater than 0, that would imply the additional benefits are greater than the additional costs, and I should choose to do that. Allocate another hour towards that, buy another one of those goods, etc. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? Okay. So in this example, what would be kind of the self-interested rational number of beers to consume? Would I consume the first beer? Well, the marginal benefit is way above the marginal cost, so yes. What about the second? Yes. What about the third? Just barely, but yes. What about the fourth? No. What would be true about the net benefit for that fourth beer? It's negative, which means if it's a negative net benefit, I'm actually worse off. Why would I make a decision that makes me worse off? That goes against that rational assumption, right? That people are making decisions rationally. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? All right. So I've got another example. Same ideas, but just slightly different. So let's say instead of like buying something, so that was like the quantity of beers that I was consuming or buying, let's say I'm looking at the number of hours I should study, right? So the quantity of hours studied. Okay. If I could put like a dollar amount to this, what's true? We said as I study more and more, I'm choosing hours that are more and more valuable to me. So when we're choosing to study, what was true about our marginal cost? As I study 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, what's happening to my marginal costs? I'm using more valuable hours, so my opportunity costs are increasing, which inherently make my, opportunity costs are baked into my total costs. So the change in my total costs will be increasing as well. Okay. So I'll have these increasing marginal costs. Now, here's another good example where let's think about the marginal benefit. If I don't study at all, start out at 0. If I just study for an hour, I at least now know the terms, some of the concepts I can start to see. What's probably true, I studied the things that I wasn't clear on the most. So that first hour probably provided me with a really high marginal benefit. Now, after I go through the things that first hour that I wasn't really sure on, I'm like, yeah, I got another hour to study. I'm going to put in towards this. I'm going to start to look at things that I kind of had a good idea on, just get a little bit of extra clarification. Well, now if I study a third hour, now I'm just going over things that I kind of already knew. A fourth hour, I'm really just like picking up really small things that might help me on the exam. So really, as I study more and more, what's happening to the marginal benefit? Decreasing, right? Those first few hours, very productive, right? In fact, I would argue there's probably a point where the additional benefits of studying start to become negative. How could you maybe explain that? So let's say it's the night before the exam. I start studying, and I study from 8 to midnight. If I then go from studying 8 to midnight, I study from 8 to 1 o'clock in the morning. What starts to happen? If I got to wake up for an 8 a.m. exam, I'm just going to not as much sleep. And so now maybe it's not that there's additional benefits. I'm staying up so much that there's now negative benefits because I'm too tired when I get to the exam. So this is kind of a just trying to put an example that might apply to you guys. We usually aren't concerned about this point because if we're thinking about where is the optimal number of hours to study, well, we said before, this is going to be where, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than the marginal cost, okay? Because what did that mean? That meant that the net benefits were greater than zero. So here, and I didn't put out like all the numbers here, but would it make sense to study this first hour, second hour, third hour, fourth hour, fifth hour? Well, for that first hour, marginal benefit is above the marginal cost. Second hour, still above. Third, still. What's true about the marginal benefit and marginal cost at this fourth hour? They're exactly equal to each other. So this is a little bit weird, but what would the net benefit be there? Yeah, someone just said it. Zero. So we say that people will choose to do something, put more time towards something, buy more of that product, as long as the marginal benefit is greater than or equal to that marginal cost. If it is equal to, am I better off buying that fourth unit? No, but I'm not worse off either. So we would say that people are, and we'll use this term more throughout the semester, are indifferent. If I go from that third and fourth, I'm just as well off in either scenario. So I don't care which one I choose there. If I do study the fourth hour, I'm just as well off as if I only study for three. So we're kind of indifferent, but we go in practice, generally will say, we'll go up to that point where they're equal. Okay. Now, would I ever study that fifth hour? Well, there, the marginal benefit is below my marginal cost. So my net benefit would actually be negative. I'd actually be worse off. So no. Okay. So this is kind of thinking about how we choose optimal levels of things. As long as that marginal benefit is greater than or equal to that marginal cost, we would choose to go up to that point. Okay. Is there anything else I wanted to say here? Yes. But before I do, any questions on this before I keep moving here? Is this making sense, hopefully a little bit? Here's a little bit outside the box kind of question, kind of seeing how well we're really grasping these concepts. What if I had zero marginal costs here? So let's say, I don't know, time is infinite, right? And so I have zero marginal costs. What I said earlier, it could be that the marginal benefit of doing something starts to become negative, but we generally never worry about that part of the marginal benefit curve. Why would I ever worry about if the marginal benefit becomes negative? Because even if the cost was zero, where would the optimal point be? So if my marginal cost was zero, the optimal point, where would marginal benefit be greater than or equal to marginal cost? Only on this portion where marginal benefits are positive. Anytime marginal benefits are negative, even if costs are zero, I would never choose to do those because the marginal benefit would be below the marginal cost. And, so we generally don't, even though in theory, there are examples like this where marginal benefit could become negative, we never really worry about them because we always have some costs, right? And even if costs were zero, we still know that these won't be optimal decisions, right? When we have negative marginal benefits, okay? All right, any questions on this before we keep moving here? Yeah. I mean, if we want to get real theoretical, but I can't think of an example. Like, what's something where you even have, so if you, but to have decreasing marginal cost, it would literally be that the more that you do of something, well, there could be an example, something about where maybe like as I study more, I can be more efficient with my studying. So yeah, there's some weird models we could come up with. We'll stick to like the basic ones, kind of what would end up taking, because even if we had something like that, where there's like, we would say like gains from practice, eventually over time, we're going to exhaust those gains and we're going to be back to the point where we're now using more and more valuable hours and we're back to these increasing marginal costs. So in theory, and we'll talk about this once we get to firms, you can have cost curves that look like that, where there might be portions where they're initially decreasing, but eventually any gains from specialization or practice, anything like that, well, eventually those will be exhausted and they're going to be overcome by the fact that we have to be using more and more valuable hours, more and more valuable resources eventually. Yep. They can't decrease in perpetuity. That really wouldn't make sense. Right? That would inherently mean the only way that could happen is if you had an infinite number of resources, but the whole thing we started out with was we're trying to analyze decisions where we have a scarce, limited amount of resources. Yeah. That's probably more than we need, but that's an interesting question. Yeah. All right. So where are we at? We've got what, another 20 minutes. So I do this a lot. So in terms of like those YouTube recordings, they didn't have anything that I just drew, right? A lot of times I'll leave slides open when we do draw things out, honestly, as a reminder to me, but also like if you do like to take notes, you know, on your slides or anything like that, you can kind of do that there. So a couple other things that I want to kind of go through before we get out of here today. Shouldn't be too bad, and then we'll kind of work through some top hat stuff. So we're going to have two types of statements that we're going to be making throughout the semester. And one of them is going to be positive statements. So positive is not like positive and negative. This is just a matter of fact, right? This is us going to be stating facts. So we can look at data and say, on average, people save 5% of their annual income, right? That is a fact based off of the data. Or we can say, you know, we look out there on average, life expectancy in these different countries is fill in the blank, right? It is, the number is what it is. Now, we're also going to start to make normative statements, which is, okay, yes, people are saving on average 5% of their income, but people are living longer. And so when we're looking at individuals' retirement decisions, in order to have enough money to sustain them throughout their entire lifetime, they should be saving more than 5% annually. Now, that's not necessarily, doesn't have to be true, right? That's based off of averages. So I'm saying this is what people, should do. This is really an opinion, right? So positive statements are statements of fact. Normative statements are really based off of models even. These are going to be statements of opinion. So even though we have a model that might predict something, that's what it's suggesting, right? It's not saying that's a fact. That's saying this is what our model would predict people should do, right? For instance, like student loans. I gave this spiel last class, but like I used to know people when I was in college that would just like take out their max every single semester. And we see this all the time. People take out loans, and you apply for a loan, I've been getting calls, take all these loans that I'm approved for. People take loans out all the time for an amount of money higher than what they should, because what don't they factor in? Interest costs, right? Which become insanely high. So yeah, taking out a couple additional $1,000 as a student, by the time you end up paying off your student loans, that might equate to 3 times that much money, right? So we can look at what people actually do, and we can look at what people should be doing, which is not taking out those full amounts more often than not, okay? So normative economics, or normative statements, that's just opinions, right? That's based off our models. This is what people should be doing, right? And if you guys haven't ever seen The Big Lebowski, you definitely should. It's a great cult classic, right? So the next thing I want to talk about a little bit is economics is at its core a science, right? We call it a social science, but it's still a science. We're not up here working with beakers and Bunsen burners, right? But at the end of the day, we're still going to develop models and theories. That's the majority of what we do in this class. We're going to look through models, come up with predictions. We're going to develop theories about what people should be doing, right? Or how markets should be acting, right? So that's kind of step one. Well, in the scientific method, what do you next do? You come up with some experiments. Now, for us in economics, Those experiments are generally people just living their everyday lives, firms making everyday decisions. So those experiments we don't ever have to really worry about. Now there is a field of called experimental economics where they come up with these experiments that they run in labs that are really pretty cool. And if you ever want to make a little bit of extra money, and I'll try to post the link on Canvas. They run experiments here all the time, and you can make a little bit of extra money by participating. And it's just a way of understanding individual decision making. But really, a lot of the times, the experiments are just people living their everyday lives. We then go out and collect data. You know, for like a chemist, they collect the data as they're running the experiment. For us, the experiment is being run by people every day. We have to go kind of somehow collect data on that. Look at credit card records, look at, firm, all these different balance sheets of firms, things like that. We'll go out and collect that data and then test our models with that data. Okay. So we're still following that scientific method. Now we're mainly going to be focusing on developing models and theories. If you kind of continue to kind of progress, at some point, I think you're going to have to take a stats course. I forget what the number is that you guys have to take. And the econ department, ours is 370. But that's essentially where you start to think about, okay, now that I've collected the data, how do I see if that data supports or rejects my theory? Okay. Another thing that we'll try to do in all of these models, and this might get a little bit frustrating because they might not seem as real world sometimes, is we're trying to analyze the effect of one single thing. So if I talk about prices going up, if prices go up, what do you think in general? Do people buy more or less of that? Less, right? I want to understand that relationship of how when the price changes, how much less are people buying? Well, I'm holding everything else constant because if the price changes, but at the same time, that product also has a celebrity endorsement or it has a recall, right? Or other things that might impact how much people buy, well, then I can't analyze that relationship of that price change. So in all of our models, we'll be talking about, okay, if price changes, what happens to the quantity purchase? Or if people, if more firms enter the market, what's going to happen to the overall price of the product? All these different things, we want to know the effect, cause and effect of one thing changing. So we're going to have to hold constant everything else. So this is the kind of term of ceteris paribus. So in a lot of these models, we're going to assume everything else is the same. Just kind of like in my value of a better view, we assumed that the apartments were identical. The only thing that was changing was one of them had a view of the sunset, the other didn't. That's the idea. Okay. So we'll be holding kind of things constant in these models. I'll come back to this one because when we talk about, well, no, I won't. I'll do this first. So I put up some links here, thinking about how we can test like a model with actual data. So I was thinking about like the returns education. You were all here getting a degree. What is that returns? Well, there's different models, and maybe ours comes up with a prediction of that if you get an additional year of education, you should see a 50% increase in wages. Okay, well, that sounds good. But that's just a model. That's a prediction. We then want to go out and look at actual wage data, right? So it takes a little bit of time for it to pull open. But if you use this link, it pulls open the BLS, which is the Bureau of Labor Statistics. They've collected data on a bunch of different workers, what their earnings were and what their degree was. So what they found was that for someone who's got a college degree, a bachelor's degree, their average earnings, I think weekly earnings or something, was $1,400. And this data is a little bit old. And they scaled it to give in a certain year. And if you only have a high school diploma, it's like $850. So do a little bit of work. The increase, right, would be about a 68% increase from having a college degree. Well, if I said every year was worth 50%, well, here, 4 years are going to be increasing it by 68. That's not quite right, right? So we can go out, we have these models, we have these predictions. We can go out and collect data and see whether or not those predictions are correct. If they're not, we go back, we try to revise our model so that hopefully it gets a prediction that lines up with something closer to what the data actually says. Okay. So you're thinking about here, like what? 68 divided by 4, that would be kind of what the actual value of each year was. So even though it wasn't matching up with the model, for you guys, this is still good news. Right, a 68% increase in wages. And I think if you get this to open up, we'll see if it'll go in the background. I don't know if it'll open up in time. Not only do your wages go up, the unemployment rate decreases dramatically of the sectors that you'll be working in. Right. Um, so I think that should hopefully cover. So what I'll get pulled up, this will pull open eventually. One thing I wanted to try, I get the right course, is just to kind of get a test run with Top Hat. After my first section, I think I know how this is going to go, but I want to test it out. Right. So on your device, go to Top Hat, whether or not you access that in Canvas or you just kind of search it in your search bar. I want to see how many people you get in here over the next 5 minutes. Right. So the join code is 114281. Generally, I would kind of do this in the class. Now, I think one thing that will help with this is at the beginning of every class, if you just have Top Hat ready, like have the web page pulled open and ready to go, I think it'll help us get synced up a little bit quicker. So as soon as I hit this start presentation, if it does prompt you, I can't remember if it will or it won't, and it might depend on like if you're using a phone versus a laptop. But if it prompts you for the join code, it'll always be the same code, which is 114281. Okay. So once I start this presentation, it should pop up with this question on whatever your device is. So some people seeing this? No, and I'm getting some head nods. So I know not all of you are in there because it tells me I've only got about 156 people currently on there. And it takes time to update, right, and sync up. And I can see some of you are answering, right? It looks like 50 of you have answered up to this point. So my ideal world, I would give you guys a question like this, although this one's easy, not using it for points today. So this is going to be starting next class period. I give you some time to work on a question, you talk with the people around you, work on it. I give you a couple minutes. You then kind of respond. I then close this out, and this will collect all of your responses. Maybe some days I'm nice and I leave it open and kind of talk through what the correct answer is. If I see people are working pretty diligently, but this would be kind of how we use those in-class quizzes. So I'm looking at this as of right now. So we got about 2/3 of the class in here. Are some of you having like Wi-Fi issues and it's just kind of giving you a spinning wheel? Okay. That's kind of what I thought would happen today. So we probably won't be using Top Hat, but it's going to be a similar thing. All I'm going to do at this point, I would pull open Canvas, have a quiz ready to go. You'll have to access, instead of Top Hat, go to Canvas, right? And then I'll manually deploy what looks like a daily quiz and then close it out as soon as we're done. Kind of, I'll give you a couple minutes to work on it. And then after, making sure you got your responses recorded. Canvas, there shouldn't be any lag issues or Wi-Fi issues. It goes very, very quickly. So, in fact, I'll have one of those ready to go Tuesday because, like I said, we've got, after this long, 4 minutes, 210 people. There's 300 people enrolled. I'm sure not everyone's here today, but I know that there's more than 215, and I know some of you are getting the spinning wheel of death. So we'll probably pivot from what I said Tuesday to using these in-class quizzes on Canvas. So what do you need to have done by the end of the day Monday? Module 2 reading, Module 1 quiz. Also, you need to get on and fill out that collaborative learning. I can waste more of your time if you don't want to just give me 30 seconds to finish class. So I got a question. Do you think if you were going to a job interview and you started walking out and the person presenting, that's going to be good? Give me 30 seconds to end class. We'll get you guys out of here. It doesn't hurt my feelings, but you guys got to learn some etiquette. That's really rude to someone if they're presenting. And if you do that to someone who could provide you with opportunities, maybe that's job opportunities or something, you don't want to do that. So I'm trying to give you some life lessons in this class as well. So once again, if you give me 30 seconds, we'd still all be out of here right now. So when I start to end class, that's not a prompt to start like packing up and walking out. That means I have a couple things I want to mention to you that probably most of the time are important before you get out of here, and then we can go. All right. I'm not trying to be a hard ass or anything, but all right. So quiz 1, module 2 reading, due by the end of the day Monday. Get on, fill out that collaborative learning poll by the end of the day Sunday so I can have those sorted and ready to go for next week. And the only other thing I was going to say Let's have a fun, safe weekend, and I'll see you guys on Tuesday. All right?